Only a botanist might distinguish between an ornamental poppy and the opium variety that constitutes a felony. But the law expects you to know the difference. While industrial farms deploy automated technologies to track supply chain integrity, the backyard gardener often operates in a blind spot until a violation notice arrives. We are examining the specific toxicity and regulatory status of plants like absinthe wormwood and bitter almonds, illustrating how a lack of botanical and legal knowledge can expose you to significant liability under both local ordinances and federal safety statutes. Yet, this domestic scrutiny is merely a fragment of a much larger picture. To fully grasp the weight of these regulations, we must first expose the invisible human infrastructure that underpins the global food supply. The global food system presents an exterior of seamless automation and logistical efficiency, yet it rests entirely on a foundation of labor that is statistically invisible and operationally essential. To maintain supply chain continuity across the massive expanse of American farmland, the sector relies on a total workforce estimated between 127 and 18 million farm workers as of 2024. This human engine drives the production cycles that fill grocery store shelves, yet roughly 5 million of these individuals operate without legal documentation. This reality creates a paradox of dependency, where the industry relies on a workforce that exists in a state of constant regulatory vulnerability. For the 2025-2026 period, estimates suggest that nationwide, between 50% and 60% of all farm workers lack authorized immigration status. This figure is not uniform across all sectors, but spikes dramatically depending on the biological requirements of the crop in question. While cereals and soybeans allow for extensive mechanization, where a single operator can harvest hundreds of acres using combined harvesters, specialty crops demand the dexterity of the human hand. Fruits and vegetables such as berries, lettuce, and tomatoes are too fragile for heavy machinery, dictating an absolute reliance on manual intervention. This biological necessity concentrates the undocumented workforce in states specializing in intensive specialty crops. California, which produces more than 40% of the nation's fruits, vegetables, and nuts, illustrates this reliance most acutely. Data indicates that in California, specifically, between 60 and 70% of farm workers in certain high-yield sectors may be undocumented. While guest worker programs like the H-2A visa exist to fill these gaps, the system is currently viewed as too bureaucratic and expensive for many producers to fully adopt. Consequently, the sector maintains its reliance on the existing undocumented workforce to meet intense hiring demands during specific cultivation windows. The work itself is characterized by physical demands that are grueling and often dangerous, further isolating the sector from the general labor pool. Because these roles are frequently low-paying and seasonal, they hold little appeal for domestic workers, creating persistent labor shortages. The industry functions through a quiet arrangement where the essential productivity of the farm relies on the suppression of the worker. Many of these individuals are excluded from federal worker protections, leaving them susceptible to wage theft and illegally low pay. Access to essential services remains a critical volatility in this system. Affordable healthcare, stable housing, and reliable transportation are frequently unavailable to this workforce, creating a precarious existence that sits just beneath the surface of the agricultural economy. The lack of comprehensive legal protections limits avenues for recourse against labor abuses, locking the workforce into a cycle of dependency. This labor dynamic creates a complex overlay of federal policy and essential productivity, where the risk is borne almost entirely by the individual worker rather than the corporate entity. While the industrial sector navigates these labor complexities through massive scale and legal departments, the home grower operates in total isolation. A commercial entity mitigates the risks of labor shortages and regulatory compliance through volume and infrastructure, spreading the human cost across millions of units of product. In contrast, the backyard gardener assumes every role personally. The comparison highlights the immense human effort required to produce a single harvest effort that is masked by the low price point of industrial produce, but becomes immediately apparent when you attempt to replicate the process on your own land. This industrial reliance on undocumented labor frames the regulatory environment that eventually trickles down to residential property rights. The government's approach to agricultural regulation is shaped by this macroeconomic tension, balancing the need for food security against the enforcement of immigration statutes. However, as the industry seeks to secure its output against labor volatility, it turns increasingly to automation in other areas. The oversight of the field is moving away from the foreman on the ground to sensors in the sky. From this macroeconomic labor view, the focus instantly shifts to the technological systems monitoring the crops themselves. The modern industrial farm utilizes a surveillance grid that effectively rivals national security apparatuses in both scope and resolution. To manage millions of acres with the necessary legal and logistical precision, commercial agricultural entities deploy a layered network of satellite imagery and AI-driven verification tools. This technology effectively eliminates the historical concept of a blind spot in commercial agriculture, tracking yield and compliance in real time. Automated systems now monitor critical variables such as soil health, water usage, and crop maturity. With sub-meter precision, these tools scan vast monocultures for the slightest deviation from the expected growth pattern, ensuring that supply chain integrity is maintained from the precise moment a seed germinates. Modern industrial agriculture leverages these advanced technologies for comprehensive crop verification and management, enabling oversight of millions of acres. The result is a system where the biological reality of the field is constantly cross-referenced against a computational model. Traceability protocols require that every input, from the specific tonnage of nitrogen fertilizer to the exact volume of irrigation water, and every biological process of growth is a computable equation. The extensive digital surveillance of industrial agriculture, powered by satellite monitoring and AI, stands as a testament to the industry's need for absolute control. Such rigorous orbital and digital oversight stands in stark contrast to the perceived privacy of a suburban backyard. The residential grower generally operates under the assumption that their cultivation is a private act, shielded from the relentless data aggregation that defines the commercial sector. However, the absence of satellites does not equate to an absence of regulation for the home grower. While large-scale farms are subject to orbital oversight, home growers face a different set of regulations, primarily local zoning laws and HOA standards. This difference highlights a shift from macro-level surveillance to micro-level, localized control mechanisms. Interestingly, the technological gap between the industrial giant and the hobbyist is rapidly closing using the same fundamental principles. Looking ahead to 2026, the Turf Mutt Foundation predicts a significant rise in precision tech-guided gardening for homeowners. This emerging trend involves integrating AI tools and smart applications for tasks like soil composition analysis and microclimate tracking. These consumer-grade technologies will enable personalized, hyperlocal yard care plans, signaling a move towards data-driven landscaping even at a residential scale. Simultaneously, the 365-day landscape trend, also predicted for 2026 by the Turfin Foundation, emphasizes year-round planning and maintenance. This approach treats the off-season not as a period of dormancy, but as a critical window for smart planning and equipment maintenance, mirroring the prosumer mindset where homeowners seek commercial-grade power and durability. Relying on localized knowledge like the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map, this strategic approach to gardening aligns closely with the precision agriculture ethos found in the industrial sector. It suggests a reliable move towards a more scientific and managed approach to residential green spaces, creating a structured environment that mimics the rigor of the industrial sector. The home gardener who adopts these tools voluntarily enters a specific system of structured management. By utilizing apps to diagnose plant pathologies or smart irrigation systems to manage water tables, the grower adopts a methodology of precision. But while the mechanism of observation changes, the presence of oversight remains constant. While AI watches the mega farm from the exosphere to ensure harvest quotas, a different set of eyes watches the residential garden. The transition from orbital surveillance to street-level zoning reveals a mechanism of control defined less by technology and more by the simple geometry of sightlines. The legal distinction between a front yard and a backyard is defined not by soil quality or solar exposure, but by the relentless metric of visibility. While the industrial farm operates under the assumption of biological utility, where the value of the land is measured strictly by its output, the residential plot is governed by the nebulous concept of curb appeal. This aesthetic standard effectively bifurcates the property into two distinct legal zones: The front yard is treated largely as a public-facing domain, a performative space where community standards override individual property rights, while the backyard retains a fragile presumption of privacy. Local municipalities and homeowners associations enforce this dichotomy through a rigorous application of covenanters, conditions, and restrictions. These codes are not merely suggestions for neighborly harmony, but binding legal contracts that prioritize visual continuity or violation. Zoning laws frequently categorize tall crops using the same terminology applied to fences or sheds, effectively classifying them as structures. Once a plant exceeds a certain vertical threshold, it becomes subject to height limits and setback rules. Research specifically notes that plants taller than 12 inches can be flagged for potentially blocking visual access to roads. This is particularly critical at corner properties, where dense vegetation can create blind turns. Municipal codes require clear sight triangles at intersections and driveways to ensure traffic safety, granting code enforcement officers the authority to demand the removal of any vegetation that obstructs these lines. Consequently, the act of growing food becomes a zoning dispute, adjudicated not by agricultural experts but by boards focused on property values and neighborhood uniformity. The enforcement mechanism in this residential context shifts from the orbital to the interpersonal, where the industrial sector utilizes satellite imagery and algorithmic monitoring to track compliance. The residential grower is surveilled by the neighbor. The blind spot, eliminated by satellites in the commercial field, is replaced here by the street-level gaze of the community. This scrutiny can escalate into legal challenges based on the Rights of Light Act. If a window has received natural light for 20 years or more, a neighbor may have a legal right to challenge any tall crops or structures such as plum trees or pergolas that obstruct that illumination. The administrative burden creates a formidable barrier to entry for the would-be self-sufficient homeowner. Navigating the permit process to install a greenhouse or even raised beds in a visible zone involves a complexity that rivals commercial licensing. Setback rules dictate that structures must be positioned a specific distance from the property line, creating a dead zone of unusable land around the perimeter of the lot. Furthermore, land classification plays a critical role. If a property is designated as informal open space, implying the public should have free access, even a simple backyard vegetable patch may require formal planning permission from a local authority. While the backyard is generally afforded a higher degree of autonomy, this privacy is not absolute. The fence line acts as a temporary shield against the aesthetic mandates of the HOA, yet it offers no protection against the deeper layers of the law. The visual access determines the legality of the crop location, creating an invisible boundary line on the property where a tomato plant is legal on one side and a code violation on the other. However, once the visual barrier is penetrated, whether by a drone, a utility worker, or a search warrant, the focus shifts from the placement of the plant to its biological identity. The regulatory environment does not end at the aesthetic level. Once the edible nature of the garden is established, the specific taxonomy of the plants begins to matter. A code enforcement officer may issue a fine for an overgrown lawn, but a different class of authority becomes interested when the vegetation in question appears on a federal schedule. The transition from a zoning dispute to a criminal investigation often hinges on the shape of a single leaf. Visual access determines the initial legality of the crop location, but the biological nature of the plant itself can invite federal scrutiny, leading to a situation where botanical ignorance is rarely accepted as a valid defense. While you may view your garden as a sanctuary of aesthetic expression, the legal system views it as a collection of biological assets, some of which possess chemical profiles that categorize them as controlled substances. Certain plants, commonly found in history books or even widely circulated ornamental catalogs, contain specific alkaloids that trigger immediate federal intervention. The distance between a horticulture hobbyist and a felon is often measured not by intent, but by the specific taxonomy of the species rooted in your soil. The most prominent example of this legal trap is the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. To the untrained eye, this flower shares a deceptive visual lineage with legal ornamental varieties for similar aesthetic value. However, the somniferum variety produces a latex sap containing morphine and codeine, the foundational alkaloids for opiate production. Cultivating this specific species constitutes a felony in the United States, regardless of whether you intend to harvest the latex or simply admire the bloom. The mere presence of the plants on your property can fulfill the statutory definition of manufacturing a controlled substance. Similarly, the cultivation of the coca plant is strictly prohibited in the United States and the United Kingdom, creating a sharp regulatory divergence from its status in the Andes. In nations like Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, the plant is legally integrated into daily life, used traditionally for muscle relaxation and stress relief. However, Western law prioritizes the substance itself, the cocaine alkaloid present in the leaf over this cultural context. This classification makes the act of gardening legally equivalent to possession of the refined narcotic, regardless of the grower's lack of industrial processing equipment. The regulatory environment becomes even more granular when examining fungi. The specific target of prohibition is psilocybin, a compound classified as a controlled substance, while spores are often tradable for microscopy purposes because they lack this active compound. The legal landscape shifts the moment germination occurs. As the mycelium begins to colonize a substrate, the organism starts synthesizing psilocybin. At this biological threshold, the activity transitions from scientific observation to the manufacturing of a controlled substance. The law prioritizes the presence of the active compound, making intent a complex element in prosecution, as the cultivation of the organism itself provides sufficient grounds for legal action. This creates a perilous environment for the curiosity-driven grower. The legal framework does not differentiate between a botanical enthusiast preserving rare genetics and a narcotics manufacturer supplying an illicit market. In these specific instances, the biology of the plant overrides the context of the garden. A raised bed containing Papaver somniferum is not viewed as a decorative landscape feature. It is viewed as an extraction site. This regulatory rigidity highlights the severe intersection of agriculture and criminal law, where the burden of taxonomical identification falls entirely on the landowner. The consequences are severe and mandated by federal sentencing guidelines. You are expected to verify the specific botanical lineage of every seed you plant, ensuring that no controlled genetics enter your soil. The taxonomy of the plant dictates its legality, effectively transforming a garden bed into a potential crime scene. While the risk here is incarceration, other plants offer a different kind of penalty. Beyond narcotics, a separate category of plants poses a direct threat to physical health and safety. In these cases, the danger is not legal intervention, but the inherent efficiency of the organism's own metabolic processes. Nature operates as a dispassionate chemist, synthesizing lethal toxins with the same biological efficiency used to produce essential nutrients. While the modern gardener often views the backyard as a benign source of sustenance, the soil frequently hosts botanical agents that possess complex and dangerous chemical profiles. Several species, often sought for their historical significance or novelty value, function as biological containment units for compounds that federal agencies classify as hazardous substances. Consider the sassafras tree, Sassafras albidum, a native species historically prized for the distinct flavor profile of its root bark. Today, however, the commercial use of sassafras oil is strictly regulated by the Food and Drug Administration due to the presence of safrole. This phenylpropene compound is not merely a flavorant, but a potent hepatocarcinogen. The biological stakes are severe. Research indicates that consuming as little as 5 milliliters of sassafras oil can be lethal. Symptoms of toxicity escalate rapidly from vomiting to high blood pressure and hallucinations. The legal complexity deepens when you analyze the chemical utility of safrole beyond its toxicity. It serves as a primary precursor chemical in the illicit synthesis of MDMA, placing the tree at a precarious intersection between food safety regulations and narcotics control. A similar chemical volatility exists within the kernel of the bitter almond, Prunus dulcis var. Amara. While indistinguishable in appearance from the sweet almonds found in grocery aisles, the bitter variety contains high concentrations of amygdalin, this cyanogenic glycoside, benzaldehyde, and hydrocyanic acid. The ingestion of raw nuts triggers nervous system slowdowns and breathing difficulties as the body struggles against the cyanide. In an industrial setting, processors mitigate this risk through rigorous heat treatments, but the homegrower assumes the risk of serving a neurotoxin in a salad garnish. The regulatory gaze also extends to Atropa belladonna. Despite its historical mystique, the plant is so toxic that the FDA has issued warnings regarding its appearance, even in homeopathic teething products. Inconsistent manufacturing in unregulated settings can lead to doses that dangerously alter heart rates and blood pressure, proving that natural is not synonymous with safe. Artemisia absinthium, commonly known as wormwood, occupies a similar space. While famous as the botanical soul of absinthe, the plant is regulated due to its thujone content. This monoterpene ketone acts as a GABA receptor antagonist, meaning that in high concentrations, it can induce convulsions and neurotoxicity. Modern distilleries employ sophisticated fractional distillation to ensure that the thujone content remains below legal thresholds. The backyard herbalist, infusing raw leaves into high-proof spirits without the benefit of a laboratory, creates a solution with unknown and potentially hazardous potency. These plants exist in a persistent regulatory gray area where safety concerns frequently trigger removal orders. Industrial-scale agricultural operations employ rigorous chemical testing protocols to mitigate the risks associated with toxic compounds like safrole, amygdalin, and thujone. This sophisticated approach to risk management stands in stark contrast to the typical homegrower, who generally lacks the necessary resources to conduct such thorough testing. Consequently, individuals cultivating these species in their backyards may inadvertently assume a greater level of personal liability. Yet while toxicity represents a clear physical danger, the legal system is often far more concerned with the flow of money than the flow of toxins. The most common legal tripwire awaiting the backyard producer is not the chemical composition of the harvest, but the specific moment the crop is exchanged for currency. The transition from a horticulture enthusiast to a regulated commercial producer does not require a corporate merger or the acquisition of industrial machinery. It occurs the precise moment a financial transaction takes place. When a single unit of currency is exchanged for a harvested vegetable, the legal status of the backyard plot undergoes an instant and irreversible transmutation. The garden ceases to be a private amenity under the law and is immediately reclassified as a commercial extraction site subject to agricultural statutes. The regulatory machinery of the state does not distinguish between a multinational conglomerate shipping thousands of tons of grain and a neighbor selling a basket of surplus peppers. The act of commerce itself engages the gears of compliance. In jurisdictionally strict environments like the United Kingdom, this threshold is defined with absolute bureaucratic precision. A home grower who begins to generate regular profits from their harvest is no longer viewed as a private citizen by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Instead, you are categorized as a professional operator. This status triggers an immediate requirement to register with the Plant Health Regulation, or PHR, via official governor U. Cordals. This registration is not a mere formality. It is a binding admission of liability. By entering this database, the grower signals their entry into the professional supply chain, voluntarily subjecting their residential plot to the same rigorous oversight designed for industrial monocultures. A failure to register while conducting business is considered a breach of biosecurity protocols. Once this threshold is crossed, a cascade of dormant requirements suddenly activates, overwhelming the unequipped producer. The local health department, previously uninterested in your compost pile, now views your soil as a substrate for potential pathogen transmission. Inspectors may require certified analysis of the water source to ensure it meets commercial irrigation standards, searching for coliform bacteria or heavy metal contamination that would be negligible in a hobby garden but actionable in a business. The processing area, often a simple kitchen sink, must suddenly meet sanitation codes drafted for industrial canning facilities. Surfaces must be non-porous, drainage must be compliant with wastewater regulations, and rigorous record-keeping must track the journey of the produce from the soil to the consumer's hand. Simultaneously, the physical location of the operation faces a new legal adversary in the form of restrictive zoning ordinances. Most residential zones possess explicit prohibitions against commercial activity, creating a zoning paradox for the aspiring microfarmer. The quintessential image of the roadside farm stand is, in many suburban municipalities, a documented zoning violation. The land is designated for habitation, not production. Consequently, the presence of customers or the transaction of goods on the property transforms the home into an illegal business front. The scale of the operation is irrelevant to the code enforcement officer, whether the revenue is $10 or $10,000. The violation remains the unauthorized use of residential land for commercial gain. Even without a commercial transaction, the biological identity of the crop can trigger legal action if it threatens the broader ecosystem. While growing food is generally permitted, the introduction of specific organisms classified as noxious weeds or invasive species shifts the jurisdiction to environmental protection agencies. For instance, water spinach, or kangkong, is a staple in many cuisines but is banned in certain regions due to its aggressive growth habit which chokes waterways and disrupts native ecosystems. In these cases, the cultivation of a simple vegetable becomes an environmental crime, illustrating that the backyard is not an isolated ecosystem, but a potential vector for ecological disruption. This regulatory environment mirrors the compliance burdens of the industrial sector, but with a critical deficiency in infrastructure. A commercial farm employs entire departments dedicated to food safety compliance, legal defense, and supply chain logistics. The backyard grower attempts to manage these same statutory obligations alone, often without the capital to upgrade their facilities to code. The disparity creates a minefield where a single error in labeling, a failure to register a specific crop, or an improper soil amendment can result in penalties that disproportionately outweigh the revenue. The fines associated with non-compliance are designed to act as deterrents for large corporations, meaning they can be financially catastrophic for an individual. The legal framework operates on the principle of consumer protection, effectively placing the entire burden of safety verification on the grower. There is no leniency for ignorance of the statute. The system treats every entry point to the food supply with equal suspicion. This final regulatory layer completes the system connecting the backyard to the global industry cosm of it. While the pursuit of food sovereignty offers a path to independence, true autonomy requires significantly more than simple botanical proficiency. It demands a rigorous comprehension of the legal landscape. You must navigate these statutory frameworks carefully to ensure that your self-sufficiency remains both safe and compliant. The tension between personal cultivation and regulatory compliance necessitates a balanced approach, respecting both the biological reality of the plant and the societal machinery of the law. What surprised you the most about the legal density of your own backyard? And what industrial journey do you want to explore next? Let me know in the comments below.